The slap echoed through the seaside grill, slicing through the soft hum of conversation like a blade. For a moment, no one moved. Glasses hovered in midair. Conversations froze. And there, in the center of the quiet, Emma Carter sat still, her hand pressed against her cheek, the sting spreading like fire. She was 7 months pregnant, dressed in soft ivory silk, her trembling eyes locked on the man across from her. Nathaniel Carter, the man everyone in the city praised as brilliant and untouchable, stood over her, cold and unflinching, his voice calm but sharp enough to draw blood. From the kitchen, the double doors swung open, and her brother, Daniel, a Navy SEAL turned chef, stepped out, his gaze fixed on her, every muscle in his body tightening as the room held its breath. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What happened next would turn a quiet dinner into the night no one would ever forget. The room stayed frozen in the shock of that moment. But this story, it's so much bigger than what happened inside that restaurant. To understand what led to that single echoing slap, you need to know the people behind the headlines. Evelyn Parker, 29 years old, 7 months pregnant. She wasn't just the young, elegant wife sitting silently at that corner table. She was a woman who had traded her quiet life for what looked like a fairy tale. And then, there was Charles Parker, 41. The respected CEO everyone admired, a man whose company built the city's skyline, a man used to control over his business, over his image, and over everyone around him. And in the kitchen, behind the heavy double doors, Ryan Parker, older brother, decorated Navy SEAL. A man who had traded combat zones for the heat of a professional kitchen, quietly running one of the hottest restaurants on the coast. That night, he wasn't the chef. He wasn't the businessman. He was just the brother. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that what had happened at that table wasn't just a flash of temper. It was something deeper, something dangerous. So many questions surrounded that night. Why did Charles snap in public, risking everything he'd worked for? What secret had Evelyn been carrying, one she couldn't share with anyone, not even her brother? And how did Ryan know from that first sharp sound that this wasn't going to end quietly? Stay with us, because this story isn't what you think, and the ending changes everything. The room was silent, but the story that night had only just begun. And to understand what happened next, you need to know the people at the center of it all. Evelyn Parker, 29 years old, 7 months pregnant, and until that moment, invisible in the way women can sometimes make themselves when they've learned that silence feels safer. To anyone watching, she looked like the perfect wife, graceful, elegant, and devoted. But beneath that careful smile, Evelyn carried more than just the weight of her unborn child. She carried a secret, one so heavy it had been reshaping her life for months, one that no one in that restaurant could see. Across from her sat Charles Parker, 41, respected, powerful, the kind of man who didn't wait for tables but owned the places where other men booked months in advance. To the world, Charles was a visionary, a man who built an empire from nothing, whose confidence filled every room before he even stepped through the door. But those who truly knew him understood that his power didn't stop at the office. He demanded perfection in every corner of his life, and he got it. Every time. Until that night. And then, there was Ryan Parker, Evelyn's older brother, a man with a quiet intensity forged in places most of us could never imagine. He had served his country, earned his scars, and carried memories he didn't talk about. When he left the Navy, he didn't look for glory or recognition. Instead, he built something steady, something quiet. A restaurant at the edge of the coast, where the sound of waves and the rhythm of a busy kitchen gave him a sense of control the battlefield never could. That night, Ryan wasn't the decorated veteran the newspapers once praised. He wasn't the chef behind the restaurant's glowing reviews. That night, he was just a brother, a man whose instincts were trained to recognize danger long before it showed itself. And when he heard the sound from the dining room, sharp and unmistakable, those instincts told him something he didn't want to believe. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't going to be contained. There are questions we have to ask. Questions that turned that quiet restaurant into the center of a story that would grip the entire city. Why did Charles Parker snap in public, risking everything? His career, his reputation, the empire he had built brick by brick, over something no one else could see? What was Evelyn hiding? What truth sat heavy on her chest that made her eyes tremble every time someone looked too closely? And why did Ryan, the man who had been trained to stay calm in the face of chaos, know immediately that what happened in that moment wasn't just a domestic argument, that this night would set into motion something far bigger, something irreversible? Before that night, before the restaurant froze in silence, before the city's whispers turned into headlines, there was a story that looked perfect from the outside. Charles Parker was the kind of man who turned heads without trying. At 41, his name carried weight in every boardroom in the city. He was the face of power, the CEO whose sharp instincts built Parker Global into a company worth billions. His days started before dawn, the kind of mornings where deals were sealed before most people finished their first coffee. Board meetings in high-rise towers, private jets waiting at runways, charity galas where every flash of the camera caught his polished smile beside Evelyn Parker, his young, beautiful wife. To the world, they were flawless. A power couple admired, envied, imitated. At charity events, Evelyn stood beside him in elegant gowns, the picture of calm elegance, smiling for the cameras as flashes burst like fireworks around her. But if you looked closely, past the perfect photographs and polished surfaces, you would see it. A subtle tension in her eyes. The quiet kind, the kind you wouldn't notice unless you knew what to look for. Evelyn Parker wasn't born into this world of glass towers and tailored suits. She grew up in a small town 3 hours inland, where mornings smelled like coffee and wet grass, and afternoons were spent sketching by the river that ran behind her family's house. She was an art teacher, the kind of person who believed in the quiet beauty of ordinary days. She met Charles at a charity fundraiser where she had been helping a friend with the event. He noticed her first. Or maybe it's more honest to say he studied her. Charles Parker didn't stumble into things. He planned them, measured them. He had an ease about him, the kind of confidence that made people lean in closer. He swept her off her feet quickly. Dinners at restaurants she'd only seen in magazines, trips to places she'd never imagined she'd visit, gifts that left her dizzy with disbelief. And in the beginning it felt like a dream. But dreams have a way of shifting in the light. The first signs were small, almost invisible. Charles never raised his voice, never shouted, never made it obvious. But slowly, he began to close the walls around her. He would compliment her dress, but then suggest what she should wear next time. He would smile when she spoke to friends, but later, quietly, he would tell her who she should avoid, who was a bad influence. At dinners, when she hesitated before ordering, he would take the menu from her hands and order for her, smiling as though it were a kindness. And in those moments, Evelyn told herself it was just his way of caring, of protecting her, because that's what he said it was, until she stopped questioning it at all. And then there was Ryan Parker, the older brother who had always been more than a brother, the boy who had stood at the edge of the playground when she was small, ready to step in if anyone made her cry. Ryan was disciplined, focused, shaped by years most people could never understand. He joined the Navy right out of high school, served in places where silence meant danger and quick decisions meant life or death. He came home older, quieter, with eyes that had seen too much but with the same steady heart that had always been his. Cooking became his way back. The measured chaos of a kitchen, the sharp focus of perfect timing, the quiet satisfaction of building something with his hands that brought other people comfort. The restaurant he opened on the coast wasn't just a business. It was a refuge. A place where he found balance in the rhythm of the work, where the steady crash of the waves outside the kitchen window reminded him that the world could still be simple. For Evelyn, Ryan had always been more than just family. When their father died too young, Ryan stepped in without hesitation. He taught her to ride a bike when she was 6, running alongside her in the quiet streets of their neighborhood until she pedaled on her own. He stood beside her at her high school graduation, at her college orientation. Every milestone a quiet promise that he would always be there. And when she called him years later to tell him she was getting married, he said all the right things. "Congratulations, I'm happy for you." But a part of him worried. He'd only met Charles Parker twice before the wedding, but something about the man made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Something in the way Charles looked at her, like she was his, like every step she took belonged to him. At first, Ryan told himself it was nothing, that maybe it was just his protective instincts, sharpened by years of training, misreading something that wasn't there. But as the months passed, as the distance between calls grew longer, as Evelyn's laughter sounded thinner each time she picked up the phone, those instincts started whispering again. And by the time she walked into his restaurant that night, 7 months pregnant, her smile tight and her shoulders tense, Ryan knew something was coming. Everyone thought Evelyn Parker was living a dream, the beautiful wife of a man who could give her the world, building a life surrounded by privilege and opportunity. But the people who loved her, the ones who really saw her, had started to notice the cracks long before that night. And soon, the world would see them too. By the time the clock neared 7, the soft hum of Coastal Kitchen had settled into its usual rhythm, the quiet clinking of cutlery, the low murmur of conversation, the steady hum of waves crashing against the cliffs beyond the glass walls. But that night, something felt different. Evelyn Parker walked in just after sunset, her shoulders slightly hunched, her steps careful and deliberate. She wore pale blue silk that clung softly to her 7-month pregnancy, her hair pinned neatly, her expression calm enough that only those who truly knew her would have noticed the flicker of unease in her eyes. Charles Parker walked 2 steps ahead, every movement sharp, precise, calculated, the way powerful men walk when they know the room belongs to them. The hostess smiled, greeted them by name, and led them to the corner table reserved for them every Friday night. And as they sat, the world around them carried on, unaware of the storm building in quiet, invisible ways. From across the dining room, diners watched discreetly, not because they recognized Evelyn, though many did, but because Charles Parker carried an undeniable presence. He ordered without glancing at the menu, his voice calm and commanding as he dismissed the waiter with a polite nod. Then, as the plates arrived, it began. Small, quiet, precise. His words slipped out like sharp blades cloaked in velvet. At first, it was a comment about her posture, about the way she shifted in her chair as she tried to ease the discomfort in her lower back. Then, a question, quiet but cutting, about why she had chosen that dress, whether she thought it was flattering enough for the evening. She didn't argue. She never did. She lowered her eyes, forced a small smile, and said nothing. But the other diners, the ones seated close enough to hear the low hum of his voice, noticed the tension that hovered like static around their table. In the kitchen, behind the heavy swinging doors, Ryan Parker worked the line with quiet focus, his hands moving with the practiced precision of a man who had spent years turning chaos into control. The sound of pans sizzling, knives chopping, and orders being called out drowned everything else. But somewhere deep inside, the instincts that had kept him alive in places where hesitation meant death hummed like a quiet alarm. He didn't know why, not yet, but he felt it. At the table, Evelyn shifted in her seat again, pressing a hand gently to her stomach. The baby had been restless all day, tiny kicks that came in sharp, uneven rhythms that left her exhausted. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft, barely audible above the hum of the dining room. "Charles," she whispered, "I'm not feeling well. Maybe we could take this to go, just this once. I think I need to rest." For a fraction of a second, there was stillness. Then, the sharp crack of skin meeting skin, sudden, brutal, deafening in its finality, tore through the restaurant like lightning. The slap echoed off marble and glass, slicing through every conversation, freezing every movement. Forks hovered mid-air, conversations died mid-sentence. And in the corner, Evelyn Parker sat frozen, her hand trembling as it rose slowly, almost disbelievingly, to her reddening cheek. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just sat there, quiet and still, as the room tilted into stunned silence. Charles Parker didn't flinch. He didn't look around. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored shirt, his expression calm, almost bored, as if nothing had happened. But the room was no longer the same. Every eye was on them, the couple in the corner, the powerful man and the quiet woman whose trembling shoulders betrayed her silence. And then, through the hum of the kitchen, through the noise of orders and clattering pans, Ryan Parker heard it. The sound. Sharp, unmistakable, a sound that didn't belong in his restaurant. He froze. Every instinct sharpened, every sense narrowed to a single urgent point. The world around him faded as the kitchen door swung open, slow and heavy, and Ryan stepped into the dining room. To the diners, it looked almost cinematic, the tall, broad-shouldered chef emerging from the kitchen, wiping his hands on the towel draped over his apron, his face unreadable. But Ryan wasn't thinking about appearances. He was thinking about Evelyn, about the sound, about the way his sister used to cry as a little girl and how, even then, something inside him had always moved first, thought later. His eyes found her instantly. Evelyn motionless, her hand still pressed against her cheek, her other hand resting protectively over her belly. And then they found Charles, the man standing over her, his jaw tight, his gaze cold, his presence filling the room like a storm cloud. Ryan's steps were slow, deliberate, each one measured, but there was no mistaking the quiet intensity in his eyes. The room was silent, holding its collective breath as the distance between them closed. What happened next would change everything, not just for Evelyn Parker, not just for Ryan Parker, but for everyone in that restaurant, and for the city that would wake up to a story it would never forget. The moment after the slap was silence, heavy, suffocating, a silence so sharp it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. And then, chaos. Diners gasped, chairs scraped against the polished floors, the quiet hum of conversation erupting into a storm of whispered disbelief. Phones were out within seconds, small glowing screens capturing every angle, every detail of the moment no one could quite process. The quiet, reserved woman in pale silk, frozen in her chair. The powerful CEO standing cold and unflinching, his jaw tight as though daring anyone to challenge him. And then, the brother, Ryan Parker, stepping forward. He didn't move quickly. He didn't shout. His steps were slow, deliberate, controlled, years of discipline radiating from every line of his body as his eyes locked on his sister. Evelyn's hand still trembled against her cheek, her other hand instinctively resting over the curve of her stomach, the small life inside her pressing against her palm as though sensing the tension in the room. Ryan's voice was quiet when it came, but it cut through the chaos like steel. "Evelyn," he said, steady and soft. "Are you all right?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her lips trembled. Her eyes glistened, wide and frightened, and then lowered to the table. Charles didn't flinch. He didn't move. "She's fine," he said, his voice sharp with authority, each word cold and dismissive. "This is between my wife and me. Sit back down. Go back to your kitchen." But Ryan didn't. He didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. He just stared, his jaw tight, his posture calm, but his eyes, those eyes, locked on Charles Parker with the quiet intensity of a man trained to assess danger in fractions of seconds. The restaurant staff froze, stunned, torn between fear and loyalty. The diners, strangers moments ago, stepped forward without thinking, closing ranks around Evelyn, one hand reaching for hers, another pressing a glass of water into her shaking fingers. Someone had already called the police. Within minutes, the sound of sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder as the world outside closed in. But inside Coastal Kitchen, the air was electric. No one moved except for Ryan, his steps carrying him forward until he stood only a few feet from the man who had just laid his hands on his sister. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. His voice, when it came, was calm, cold, measured. "You need to leave," Ryan said. The words were simple, but there was no mistaking the steel behind them. Charles tilted his head, his lips curving into a tight, humorless smile. "You don't tell me what to do," he said, his tone dripping with the quiet arrogance of a man who had never been told no. "This is my wife, my family, my business. Sit down, chef, before you regret it." Around them, phones continued recording, capturing every word, every look, every second of tension as the night spiraled further into a moment that would soon explode far beyond the walls of that restaurant. By the time the police arrived, the entire dining room was alive with hushed voices and shaky hands, holding phones that had already sent the video into the digital ether. Officers moved carefully, separating the parties, guiding Evelyn gently away from the table as Ryan followed close behind, his protective presence never wavering. Outside, under the soft glow of the streetlights, the flash of cameras caught every angle as Charles Parker, the man with the perfect image, was questioned, his expression still tight with restrained fury. The video hit social media before the police had even left the parking lot. First, a single post, shaky, grainy footage of the slap itself, then another from a different angle, then another. Within hours, the story had a life of its own. On Twitter, the headline trended at #1, CEO assaults pregnant wife in public. On Facebook, strangers debated what they thought they knew. Some condemned him outright, calling for his arrest, his resignation, his empire to crumble. Others, fewer but louder, defended him. "We don't know what happened before the video," they wrote. "Maybe she provoked him." The comments split like lightning through a summer sky, sharp and divisive, but none of it changed the truth. The video was everywhere, and there was no going back. By morning, news outlets had picked it up. Cable shows ran the footage on a loop, blurred for sensitivity, but unmistakable in its brutality. "Charles Parker," one anchor said solemnly. The CEO, hailed as one of the most influential men of the decade, was caught on camera striking his pregnant wife at a high-end restaurant last night. The city woke up to his name splashed across screens, headlines screaming, voices dissecting every second of the 30-second clip that had become impossible to ignore. The investigation began before dawn. Detectives combed through the restaurant, speaking with witnesses one by one. Their voices shook as they recounted what they'd seen. A woman, quiet and terrified. A man towering above her. A brother stepping into a storm he had never asked for. Ryan Parker met the detectives quietly, away from the cameras, his face calm, his words careful. Without hesitation, he handed over the restaurant's surveillance footage, every second, every angle, unflinching proof of what had unfolded. He didn't look for leverage. He didn't look for control. He wanted only the truth, and for his sister to be safe. But as the investigation deepened, the narrative began to twist. Charles Parker's PR machine roared to life before the ink on the first police report had dried. Statements were released to the press, carefully worded, coldly strategic. "An unfortunate misunderstanding," the statement read. "Mrs. Parker has been experiencing significant stress related to her pregnancy, resulting in heightened emotional responses. Mr. Parker deeply regrets the incident and is committed to resolving this matter privately as a family." On talk shows, commentators dissected the footage while lawyers debated its implications. Online, bots and carefully crafted accounts began flooding comment sections, painting Evelyn as unstable, manipulative, a woman desperate for attention or money. Quietly, whispers began. "She made it up. She's exaggerating. She wants control. It was the same tactic used countless times before in stories just like hers. Discredit the victim, protect the image, control the narrative. But what Charles Parker didn't count on was the one thing that would unravel everything: the evidence the investigators were about to find. Because what the world didn't yet know was that the night at Coastal Kitchen was only the surface. Beneath it, behind the polished walls and perfect smiles, there were cracks. And once those cracks began to show, there would be no way to hide what was about to come. The headlines didn't slow. The video didn't stop circulating. And as the days turned into weeks, the investigation pulled at threads Charles Parker had spent years hiding. At first it was quiet. Whispers, fragments, documents that only hinted at what was to come. But then, like a storm breaking, the truth started to surface. Court records, long buried and sealed, began to see the light of day. Old files from a different city, a different life, evidence of a man who had been here before. Records of a relationship years ago with a woman who had vanished from public view after filing police reports that never went to trial. Reports that painted a chillingly familiar picture: quiet control, subtle isolation, and finally, violence behind closed doors. She had signed non-disclosure agreements, silenced with money and fear, but the pattern was undeniable. And this time, there was video, undeniable, unaltered, watched by millions. Former employees began to come forward, their voices shaky but steady as they spoke of the man behind the perfect smile. Assistants who remembered the sharp tone in his voice when something went wrong. Drivers who had seen bruises, small and hidden but unmistakable. An ex-partner who, after years of silence, finally broke it. Her voice barely above a whisper as she recounted nights filled with the same fear Evelyn had learned to mask. The police called it a pattern. The prosecutors called it a case. But Ryan Parker called it what it was: a war. And he fought it quietly, methodically, the way only a man who had lived by discipline and precision could. He didn't shout into cameras. He didn't storm into offices. He gathered evidence, records, timelines, every thread of information that could protect his sister, every detail that could paint a picture the world wouldn't be able to ignore. While the public watched, while social media churned with speculation and half-truths, Ryan was moving with purpose. He leaned on the skills the Navy had taught him: observation, patience, control. He tracked meetings, calls, quiet movements. Surveillance footage caught Charles leaving late-night meetings with men whose names raised quiet alarms. Crisis managers, private investigators, people who specialized in intimidation and silence. In one clip, Charles sat alone in his car, the city lights washing over his face, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. In another, he paced the length of his office, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice sharp, his words clipped. He wasn't just trying to protect his name. He was planning. It wasn't just a slap. It was a pattern, one that had gone unchecked for years. And now, the world was finally watching. For Evelyn Parker, the days blurred together. Safe houses, doctor's appointments, the quiet hum of fear that settled in every corner of her thoughts. She wanted to disappear, to find a moment of stillness, but the world wouldn't let her. The calls didn't stop, the headlines didn't slow. And through it all, Ryan stayed close, quiet, steady, present. He never pushed. He never asked. He simply stayed, ready for the moment she was ready to speak. That moment came late one night. The house was quiet, the steady hum of the ocean beyond the windows filling the silence between them. Evelyn sat at the edge of the couch, her hands folded over her stomach, her eyes fixed on a point far beyond the room. Ryan sat across from her, his posture calm, his eyes steady, waiting. And then softly, almost as if the words weren't meant to be spoken aloud, she said it. This wasn't the first time. Ryan didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. Her voice trembled, quiet but unflinching as the words spilled into the room. words that had been locked away for far too long. She told him about the early days, the soft corrections, the subtle controls, about the dinners where she smiled through gritted teeth because that was what was expected of her, about the nights when Charles's words cut deeper than any slap ever could, about the first time he'd crossed the line, the apology that came after, the flowers, the promises that it would never happen again. "It started small," she whispered, her eyes glistening, fixed on her hands. "A comment here, a look there. And then, it wasn't small anymore. I kept telling myself it would stop, that I could fix it if I just tried harder. But it never stopped. It just got quieter, more careful, until that night. Until everyone could see what I had been hiding for so long." Ryan listened, every word carving deeper into the silence between them. His jaw was tight, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, but his voice, when it finally came, was steady, even, almost soft. "You're safe now," he said. "You hear me? You and that baby, you're safe." Evelyn's tears fell silently, her breath shaking, as years of fear and silence poured out in the quiet of that room. She told him about the threats, the isolation, the way Charles had convinced her that no one would believe her, that her life, their life, belonged to him. She told him about the nights she thought of leaving and the mornings she stayed, convincing herself that maybe, just maybe, this time he meant the apology. And Ryan sat there, the quiet strength of a man who had seen war but never anything as personal, as raw, as this, listening as his sister finally spoke the truth that would shatter everything Charles Parker had built. By morning, the story had shifted again. The investigation deepened, the evidence was mounting, and Charles Parker, the man the world once praised, the man whose name had been synonymous with success, was unraveling in real time. The courtroom was cold, sharp, and clinical. Polished wood benches, the faint hum of cameras outside the heavy doors, the steady shuffle of reporters waiting to catch a glimpse of the man they had once called untouchable. Charles Parker sat at the defense table, perfectly tailored in a deep navy suit, his expression calm, almost smug. To anyone watching, he still looked like the man who owned every room he walked into, the man who built empires and broke competitors without lifting a finger. His legal team surrounded him, the city's most expensive attorneys, confident and composed, whispering strategy as the judge entered the room. Evelyn Parker sat only a few feet away, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face pale but steady. 7 months had passed since that night. 7 months since the restaurant had fallen into stunned silence. Her body was stronger now, her child safe and healthy, but the quiet tremor in her chest hadn't faded entirely. Ryan Parker sat beside her, shoulders squared, his presence quiet but unyielding. The steady anchor that had never wavered, not through the media storm, not through the threats, not through the endless nights when fear seemed louder than sleep. When the trial began, the defense did exactly what everyone expected. They painted Charles as the victim, a man pushed too far by a wife they called unstable and emotional, a woman they claimed had fabricated years of abuse to secure financial control in the marriage. They spoke with rehearsed charm, their words sharp and deliberate, weaving a story that turned Evelyn into the aggressor and Charles into the misunderstood husband. And for a moment, watching them, you could almost believe it. Almost. Then the video played. The footage from that night filled the silent courtroom, every angle captured in sharp detail. Evelyn seated at the table, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. The quiet exchange, the tension that had been invisible to strangers until it wasn't. And then, the sound. Sharp, violent, undeniable. The slap. The collective gasp from diners. The stillness that followed. The slow, deliberate steps of Ryan Parker as he emerged from the kitchen, his eyes fixed on his sister, his entire body coiled with quiet control. You could hear a pin drop when the clip ended. Even the attorneys shifted uneasily in their seats, their rehearsed confidence faltering under the weight of what the jury had just seen. The judge's eyes lingered on the screen for a moment longer, his expression unreadable but heavy with something that told the room this case had just shifted. But the twist no one saw coming came with the next witness. When the doors opened and Charles's sister, Evelyn Parker, stepped into the courtroom, the room tilted. She was immaculate, poised, confident, her sharp heels clicking softly against the polished floor. But there was no loyalty in her gaze when it met her brother's across the aisle. No softness, no hesitation, only resolve. When she took the stand, the room leaned forward, and when she spoke, every word carried the weight of someone who had finally stopped looking away. She told the court what she had tried to deny for years, the quiet phone calls in the middle of the night from women too afraid to speak publicly, the bruises she had seen, the arguments she had overheard. She told them about the recordings she had kept, quiet insurance she'd never intended to use. And then, with steady hands, she handed those recordings over to the prosecution. And when the recordings played, Charles's voice sharp, cold, unguarded, the room froze. "If she embarrasses me again," his voice said, calm but chilling, "there will be consequences. She needs to remember her place. They all do." In that moment, the man who had spent years controlling every narrative, every headline, every whisper in every room, lost control. Completely. The verdict came quickly. Guilty. Guilty of assault. Guilty of domestic violence. Guilty of violating the very trust and safety a husband vows to protect. As the judge read the sentence, 5 years in state prison, mandatory counseling, probation to follow, Charles Parker didn't flinch. His jaw stayed tight, his eyes cold, locked on Evelyn across the room. There was no apology in his gaze, no remorse, only the same quiet calculation that had defined him for years. And then, as the bailiff approached, as the cuffs closed around his wrists, Charles Parker leaned forward, his eyes sharp and unblinking, and stared at Evelyn Parker one last time. She didn't look away. Not this time. When the doors closed behind him, the room exhaled. In the months that followed, the world moved on. Headlines shifting, stories fading, the relentless tide of news carrying the story out to sea. But for Evelyn Parker, the rebuilding was slow, deliberate, intentional. Her world was smaller now, quieter, but for the first time in years it was hers. She spent her mornings walking along the coast with her son, feeling the steady rhythm of the ocean in sync with her own breath. She returned to painting, to teaching, to the quiet parts of herself she had lost in the noise of control and fear. And through it all, Ryan Parker was there, quiet, steady, watching from the edges, but never far. He returned to his restaurant, to the hum of knives on cutting boards and the quiet chaos of the line, but everyone who worked there noticed it. The way he watched the door more carefully now, the way his shoulders seemed a little straighter when Evelyn visited, the way the staff lowered their voices when they saw her walk through the dining room, as though instinctively protecting her space. In the end, the narrator's voice softens, carrying the weight of everything that has come before. In the end, it wasn't strength that saved her. It wasn't wealth or power, or the attention of millions of strangers watching her story unfold on their screens. It was courage. The quiet, steady courage of a woman who finally decided she deserved more. And the brother who refused to look away. The courtroom is empty now. The cameras have been packed away, the reporters chasing their next headline. But for Evelyn Parker, the silence that follows is different this time. It isn't heavy. It isn't suffocating. It feels like the first clean breath after years of holding it in. She walks out of that courthouse into the open air, her son's tiny hand wrapped around her finger, the weight of fear no longer pressing on her shoulders. Beside her, Ryan Parker stays close, not as the Navy SEAL trained to protect, but simply as the brother who never stopped fighting for her. Justice, the world calls it. A conviction. A sentence. Years behind bars for Charles Parker. But as Evelyn walks down those courthouse steps, the question lingers. What is justice really, when the scars left behind can't be measured in years or headlines? When the nightmares don't fade just because the door to a cell slams shut, the restaurant goes back to its quiet rhythm in the weeks that follow. The sound of knives on cutting boards, the low hum of conversation, the waves crashing against the rocks beyond the glass walls. Ryan Parker moves through his kitchen with the same deliberate calm he always has, but there's something different in his eyes now. A quiet watchfulness, a subtle protectiveness that never really leaves. And every so often when Evelyn walks in with her son balanced on her hip, the entire place seems to pause, the air softer, safer. Because now, everyone knows. Everyone remembers. And yet, beyond the story, beyond the viral videos and endless debates, the truth is simple. In the end, it wasn't strength that saved her. It wasn't the glare of the cameras or the endless noise of strangers weighing in. It was courage. The quiet courage of Evelyn Parker finally choosing herself. And the unwavering presence of Ryan Parker, the brother who refused to look away when the world wanted to pretend nothing was wrong. So now we ask you, what do you think? Was justice truly served? Was 5 years enough for the pain, the fear, the silence Evelyn endured for so long? And if you had been there that night, sitting at one of those tables as the sound of that slap echoed through the restaurant, what would you have done? Would you have stayed frozen in disbelief? Or would you have stepped forward? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because if you thought this story was shocking, if you thought the layers of power, fear, and courage we uncovered here were enough to leave you speechless, just wait until you hear our next story.